Hello, Buzzkillers. It's the old professor here, coming to you from the Buzzkill Bunker, and we have never done a show like we're doing today. We've never done a show on something that's very contemporary or relatively recent, although the subject we're going to tackle has an awful lot of historical connections to it, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about this new book called Afterlife, A Collective History of Loss and Redemption in Pandemic America. And fortunately, we have with us two of the editors of this new book, Dr. Kerie Leigh Merritt and Dr. Yohuru Williams, who are here with us to talk about the book. One of the other editors, Dr. Ray Lynn Barnes, isn't here, but we want to say right off the bat that this is among the books that has floored me the most of recent books that we've highlighted on the show, because it is so fascinating how much thought not only went into it, but how much thought went into the individual chapters. 19 chapters, 19 different people, all sorts of different perspectives, all sorts of different research that's gone into it. So first of all, let me just say thank you both for coming on. Thank you, Dr. Merritt.
Thanks for having us.
And thanks, Dr. Williams.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Let me ask you first, if you don't mind, what made you decide to do this book, and how on earth did you get all of these important people together to contribute chapters? This is extremely impressive.
Well, the conception of the book really happened in late 2020. Ray Lynn was in New York City. Yohuru is in Minnesota, Minneapolis. I am in Atlanta. And so we were all in cities that were shut down by the pandemic. We were all kind of, alone in our houses and our apartments. And as colleagues, we were just having conversations about, how historical this event, this moment was, and not just because of COVID, but because of, again, everything that was happening with Trump and with white supremacy and, the kind of slide into fascism that we were seeing. And we thought, who's documenting this history? Who is going to tell the story of what's happening in the early 2020s? And so we wanted to jump on it and get in there and make sure we had a very diverse group of people telling the story and really documenting what was going on at the time.
I would agree. There was this profound sense of alienation that I think we all felt. And I was a huge fan of Kerie Leigh's and had read a lot of her commentary, her first book. But I think what the pandemic did was allow all of us to engage in social media spaces, like kind of virtual spaces, in a way that previously maybe you're giving someone accolades about that work. But as we were all trying to make sense of the pandemic, as news services and television programs were, reaching out to historians in particular to try to put into context what was continually described or consistently described as this kind of unprecedented moment. And here, historians in particular would push back and say, no, we've had similar moments to this before that can illuminate for us, some of the challenges that we're seeing in our contemporary moment. I think that also fueled, our desire to come together and say, other scholars have to be feeling in the same way that we do, that we have something to contribute to this, but also at the same time, and I think this was important both for Kerie Leigh and for Ray Lynn, that we didn't want to mandate any type of topics for these individuals. We wanted them to write about what they were experiencing, but also their unique perspective with regard to the pandemic and the racial reckoning itself. And so I think that's also what kind of guided us. It was this opportunity for, I think, scholars in a way to be very vulnerable and recognizing that this unprecedented, as it was called, string of events was taking place, and yet we were experiencing it and then had insight on how people in the past have developed a sense of resiliency, how they've worked to safeguard American democracy, how they've thought about and what type of social movements have emerged with regard to racial discrimination, gender discrimination in the past, and how we might have be on the precipice of what Kerie Leigh and I write about in the conclusion, a third Reconstruction in America.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating, and I think Buzzkillers will be amazed if, first of all, if I read out the titles of the different parts, I think they'll see how much you were able to draw out of these most recent few years, and also to show exactly where the book is headed towards the possibility of a third Reconstruction. So part one is about American exceptionalism, colonization, and immigration. Part two is mass death and white supremacy, Civil War and civil rights. Part three is finding light in the darkness, memory and grief. And part four is the reckoning. Now, it's not a stretch to say that this is, I think, the most comprehensive examination of what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 years than I've ever read in any other venue, journalism, even the most thoughtful journalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, essayists. You're really showing us all kinds of things that are related to not only the pandemic, but the other things that have been going on during the pandemic. There's no question there. It's just a sort of way to show people and tell people, every time we live through major events, there are important historical things to talk about, but also important other social things to discuss as well. You could have easily written a book that was just, gee whiz, this happened, this was the response, were the effects, but you went so much deeper. Again, no question there. Just Dr. Merritt, was that an idea of how you approached it from the very beginning, or did that develop as you worked through the book and got the contributors?
It really was an idea from the beginning. It was a seedling of an idea. We didn't honestly know what we were going to get. As Yohuru was saying, we wanted to pick people primarily that were good writers. These are people that have won Pulitzer Prizes, some of them, Bancroft Prizes, their MacArthur Award, Genius Grants. And so we picked people that were going to be the right people to document the seriousness of the loss, the seriousness of the moment in which we were all enduring and trying to survive through. And we wanted to give them that creative space to do it. A lot of historical writing and even legal history, of several legal scholars in here, it's very formulaic, it's very tedious at times. And so we wanted to give them that complete creativity to do whatever they wanted to do. And what we got back in a lot of cases was surprising. For instance, we had Attorney General Keith Ellison, who was literally prosecuting Derek Chauvin, the murderer of George Floyd at the time. Yep. And we figured, he'd write about that. But instead, he wrote a very, very personal essay, just beautiful memorial to his mother, who sadly passed away from COVID in that first wave. And so what people chose to write about was incredibly striking, because many of them were, instead of being something political or overtly historical, they were kind of micro histories of their families, histories of themselves in a lot of ways.
Dr. Williams, I see lots of these chapters, they're from people like Philip Deloria, Mary Dudziak. These are prominent historians, prominent experts on certain aspects of American life. And yet in the chapters, as Dr. Merritt says, they're bringing out something different. You might have expected one thing to come from them, and yet something very, very different comes. Dr. Deloria's chapter is just astounding. It's called Guitars, Dreams, Dogs, and Tears, Grieving Hard Histories. How did you react when those types of chapters came through?
It was powerful because I was much more traditional than Kerie, Leigh, and Raylin were in thinking about this book. And so when we first started the process, I was thinking that we would have scholars weigh in on their areas of expertise. And so Kerie, Leigh in particular kept saying, I think we need to be very conscious of the fact that people are dealing with grief, their own challenges in multiple ways. And so we have to create space for them to talk about that history, but in the context of what we were all feeling. Because it was important for us, Raylin and Kerie, Leigh and I all talked about the WPA and how in that moment they were documenting, those writers were documenting that history, but they were also living that history. And we hope to produce a record that was very similar, that you would get glimpses of what people were experiencing as they were trying to contextualize what they were experiencing. So we got this phenomenal piece, I remember, from Robin D.G. Kelly on writing the obituary for his father in the midst of this kind of very personal thing that many of us experienced due to the loss occasioned by COVID. And he wrote about it in a very personal way of dealing with the personal grief on top of, or layered on top of, a pandemic. What we loved about Phil Deloria's piece is that a lot of us lost entertainers, people that, we didn't know personally, but it felt personal because these were people that we grew up with. There was an intimacy there. In fact, Jacqueline Dowd Hall in her piece talks about the grief that came before the grief. If we were to describe that in terms of entertainment or sports, Kobe Bryant's death in January, before the mass death and watching all these people who we were so familiar with pass as a result of COVID, was kind of this stark reminder of the fragility of human life. And to have someone like Phil Deloria kind of talk about that through the lens of the loss of an entertainer and what that meant, and kind of reflecting in a very broad sense on what this type of loss means, kind of the afterlife of COVID. And that's, what we were trying to get at. One of my favorite pieces in here is by Tara Hunter, and she talks about the new Negro servants disease. And so that was kind of straightforward in the sense that she's drawing these parallels between what happened at the turn of the century with regard to how people were dealing with infectious disease, and our contemporary moment where clearly racism still impacted the way that we were tackling that. At the same time, we got this phenomenal piece by Eula Taylor called Losing My Starbucks Table, and it was all about the intimate loss associated with what happens when the routines that we all knew were suddenly disrupted in ways that we took for granted, and the communities that we built, the micro communities. So when Kerie Leigh says they became these powerful micro histories, I think in some sense they'll document for future generations what the world looked like in 2020 and how much it's changed as a result.
Dr. Merritt, how did this sort of history and the way we all teach the pandemic of 1918, 1919, the so-called Spanish flu, which we've done shows on before, how did that sort of inform the way not only the editors approached the book, but do you think it had an impact on the way a lot of the people wrote their chapters? Because after all, almost all these people are in fields where they would be teaching that period in their college classes.
That's a really interesting question. None of us are actually medical historians, and the appendix that Raylene and I wrote on basically it's a short history of inoculations and vaccinations in America. It's actually a great thing to teach with. It really does show kind of a through line in America that every time there are pandemics or epidemics, not only has the government, since the time of George Washington, been responsive in a proactive way, in a way to try to save people from death or disease, that shows how different this time was in many different ways. But also, the other through line is showing how politicized, I think, all of these, and how highly racist and xenophobic these kind of pandemics and epidemics can be. But also within that, the flip side of it is there's a sense of hope. There's a sense when we're going through these horrible times of tragedy and mass death, there's always a tiny little window of time, a period of time where there's a chance for real change in American society. And so we want to highlight that. And we talk about the way that LGBTQ plus people in the 80s and 90s are really actually using death, using their actual bodies, their corpses, to protest the way that the government is handling, mishandling the AIDS epidemic. Mm-hmm. And so, drawing these parallels through history and showing people how we have fought back and fought for our rights and fought for healthcare and basic human rights from the government before, I think is a very powerful lesson. Also, what comes through the book as a whole is this remarkable reaction against government in some ways. The anti-Fauci movements is very similar to the anti-government movements or the anti-health department movements in 1918, 1919. And that was shocking to me in certain ways, particularly when you look at Stephen Barry's chapter on Confederates Take the Capitol and other parts of the book where the authors talk about these, not only skepticism of government, but outright hostility. And historians must be tremendously troubled by that, because we can see how these things have operated in the past, as you mentioned, going all the way back to George Washington. And it's almost as if we want to stand up and shout, no, don't do this, is not what we want to do. Yet it happens every time. Sorry, that's an open-ended question. Whoever wants to take that can jump on it.
I'm appreciating your questions in particular, because I think that's why we wrote the book, is I think this moment has generated more questions. And I think anyone who reads this book will come away, if you read Stephen Barry's chapter, you don't walk away magically being able to make sense of January 6th.
Right.
You walk away asking some fundamental questions about the nature of American democracy, our democratic Republican institutions, the fragility of our republic, and the importance that we should attach to the words of a prominent legal scholar who's argued that American political life, at least, is dependent on a civil theology that we all buy into. And when you begin to knock away the foundations of that, what you expose is the fact that this is a great experiment, a noble one. We can define it in that way, a flawed one, but an experiment nonetheless. And we have to be caretakers of those institutions if we want it to continue. It's a theme that Kerie Leigh and I pick up in the final chapter, where we talk about Congressman John Lewis, and we kind of talk about his example. If anyone should have lost hope in 2020, it was John Lewis. If anyone could have been bitter, it should have been John Lewis. Here's somebody who's born into a world in which segregation is the norm, He spills blood in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in support of voting rights, what will ultimately become the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He is the first to lash out against the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013 after Shelby County versus Holder strips away some of those protections for voting rights. And he dies in the midst of a national Black Lives Matter movement. And yet he writes his final letter to the American people, posthumously published in the New York Times, saying, "Together we can redeem the soul of America."
Right.
That's very hopeful. But it's also deeply invested in that civil theology, which I think you're picking up, that runs through some of these essays in very direct ways, in pieces like Peniel Joseph's and Kerie, Leigh, and my conclusion, but also in ways that are more subtle. And so you pick this up in Jacqueline Dowd Hall's phenomenal piece. You pick this up in Kerie Leigh's piece, which is my favorite piece in the volume. I have no problem admitting that my co-editor wrote a piece that moved me to tears, where she talks about deaths of despair.
Mm-hmm.
You pick it up in Heather Thompson's work, where she's talking about the permeability of cells and how this impacts prisoners, which again is part of our core democratic values, and what happens when we undermine those values to a degree that people lose faith in that civil theology.
Dr. Merritt, what do you think about that? We'd like to save as much as we can about the concluding chapter, which is, again, so strong, for the end of the show. But even still, what are your thoughts on what we're talking about now?
I think that this is going to be the main question going forward, is how involved is government going to be? And they've literally just signaled to us this week that they're not going to be involved. The fact that we expected this, obviously, under a Republican president, but now we're under Democratic leadership, and we've literally got no one fighting for any kind of universal health care after surviving the worst pandemic in our nation's history, the worst any kind of event with the death toll of this number. We are at the worst. Literally, we're having, even this month in January of 2023, we had days where there were more than 1,000 Americans dead of COVID, 1,000 Americans dead. And we are pretending like this hasn't happened. The government is gaslighting people. The media is gaslighting people. We want to pretend like we've moved past it. And the reality is that is not right. We're going to have a crisis of infrastructure in the coming years because we don't have universal health care. We don't have a way to deal with people with long COVID. We don't really know what long COVID is going to look like, but we know it's going to be there. We know that a significant proportion of our population is not going to be able to work full-time jobs. And so unless we actually deal with this crisis right now, it's just going to get worse with each passing year. And then the last thing I'll add to that is the other thing that bothers me as someone who studies whiteness and white culture and racism is, the kind of isolation that people have been in, not just under COVID, but now even, in this supposedly post-COVID world, that we have become increasingly isolated. And while that can be, social media can be used as a force of good, obviously it can be used as a force of bad too. And so you're going to have a lot of people who are lonely, who are sick, who are at home, who are angry at the government, who need to displace that anger. And that is the time, that's absolutely ripe for some kind of demagogue to sweep in, some kind of fascism. And my fear is that, under Trump, you had a fundamentally unsound, unprepared person. And the next time, if you have somebody half competent, they're going to be able to do the things that Trump and his followers couldn't do. And that's a very scary prospect.
I think it's safe to say, and I don't mind saying this in a history program, that, that the governor of Florida is who you were kind of referring to. Before we go for a break, though, I do want to jump up and down and say how happy I am that you put in these appendices at the end of the book, as you say in the introduction and the preface, I can't remember which one, that these are kind of teaching and teachable appendices. You can actually bring these things into class. So, Professor Merritt, could you please tell us first about this first appendix, which you mentioned it a second ago, but a brief history of public health in America and how that appendix specifically might be used in the classroom. We have an awful lot of teachers in Buzzkill Nation. Right.
Well, I guess the big thing to understand is that so much of the information that was going around about medical history and how we've dealt with pandemics or epidemics in the past was coming from right-wing media and was just, not misinformation, but outright lies. And the fact is, like I said earlier, is that we have a long history in this country of the government actually proactively dealing with disease and dealing dealing with public health. And the fact that we don't have that now is an absolute moral travesty. The fact that we don't have a massive movement by the people pushing for universal health care after all of this has happened is just kind of flummoxing, because we need health care now more than we have ever needed it in this nation. And we are one of the richest nations in the world, and yet we are the only rich nation to not have universal health care. And so that's actually something that Yohuru and I really tried to talk about in the conclusion, is that we have to think about other ways aside from the government, to help people out right now, because the government is just not reacting the way it should be to people's needs in this country. And so we do take a lot of solace in what civil rights workers did in the 1950s and 60s, and that is an intense grassroots movement of dealing with your family, your community, your neighborhood, dealing with the local and worrying about things that you can change on that local level, how you can make people in your community better, healthier, have food in their bellies, have a roof over their heads. And so when when we're in, I'm not going to say you because it's me too, when we're all in despair over the state of things, the state of this nation right now, you look to things that you can change, look to something that you can do today to make somebody's life better.
And Dr. Williams, your appendix, Black Lives Matter and the Beginnings of the Third Reconstruction, I think, again, it's one of these things you can literally take into the classroom and show even high school students the importance of the broadest aspect of this moment that we're in. Why did you decide to write that, and why should we think about this as possibly the beginnings of the Third Reconstruction?
I think the reason we felt that was necessary has been made manifest in the last few days with what's happening in Florida, with Florida's governor pushing back on an advanced placement African American Studies course, the core of which is an interrogation of African American history and what Dr. King would call the warts we associate with American society and culture because we are so deeply rooted in these racist traditions. Mm-hmm. I think it is appropriate, even in this moment, to talk about that conclusion in the light of the killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis by police, and people saying, well, they were 5 Black officers, but missing the through line that policing in this country doesn't matter who does the actual enforcement, what those people look like. It's the institution that's fundamentally flawed. So we thought it was important to be very explicit about what that opportunity was in 1865 for a second birth of liberty, which in a lot of ways failed because of the inability of government, of individuals in that moment to recognize how important it was to take on these issues in a way that were affirmative of the dignity of human life and affirmative of citizenship, and to be expansive in the way that they were thinking about this. You don't tackle the issue of gender, and so then we get the trauma and turmoil of 1920. And then you find yourself in 1963 with Pauli Murray pleading with A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King to include women at the March on Washington. And only 2 women speak at the March on Washington. And then we find ourselves in a contemporary moment where, the National Black Lives Matter movement started by 3 African-American female activists who have to call out consistently that LGBTQ plus and women are also victims of police brutality. These are the reasons that we felt it was important in those appendices to be very explicit about that. In terms of African Americans in particular, I think the nation got a taste of what Kerie Leigh was talking about when she talked about the gaslighting of Americans. And the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, there was this conversation about this mistrust in the African American community of medical doctors and of the medical institutions and of medicine in general. That's a holdover. That's the afterlife of experimentation on Black and brown bodies that, Harriet Washington deals with in her book, Medical Apartheid. That's the afterlife of the Tuskegee experiment. And we wanted to ask in a very deliberate way, kind of raise those questions and those conclusions by putting them in historical context. What will be the afterlife of the long 2020? Like Kerie Leigh says, in a very powerful way just a few minutes ago, we were trying to empower people to think about what they could do to make a difference. We recognize that history is foundational to them even understanding how not to be paralyzed, but to really think constructively about what needs to be tackled now so that we're not 40 years out and someone's looking back and saying, man, you could see it. And I think sometimes historians and legal scholars, we can see it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Well, we need to take a little break for advertising, and so our corporate overlords will put in a couple of ads here. And when we get back, I'd like to ask Dr. Merritt and Dr. Williams to talk about their specific individual chapters in the book. So Buzzkillers will be back in just a second. Buzzkillers, we are back with Dr. Kerie Leigh Merritt and Dr. Yohuru Williams, who are here to talk to us about Afterlife, this very, very important book, new book about life during the pandemic years in the United States, and not just about the pandemic, but a lot about other things that are going on. Before we left, I said that I'd like to ask you both to talk about your specific chapters. Dr. Merritt, your chapter is Suicide and Survival, Deaths of Despair in the 2020s. What should the Buzzkillers know about that?
Well, this was the most personal thing I've ever written. It was definitely the hardest thing I had ever written. And I wrote it last after editing literally everybody else's essay in this book. And I wrote it coincidentally while I had COVID. And I probably should have written about the experience of having COVID because that was a horrible, horrible experience. But I so badly wanted to get this story out to people, primarily because it deals with suicide and deaths of despair. And my concern was that people wouldn't be committing suicide necessarily during the initial lockdowns, during the initial first few years of the pandemic, because you would be in almost a survival type mode. You would be trying to get through it, trying to make it to the next day. My fear was that once we got back to, quote, normal society, that's when we would see those suicide rates and deaths of despair rates, which are, of course, suicide, but also deaths from drug overdoses and, alcoholic deaths. And so I knew that those rates would start spiking, and they have. And I wanted to write this because I had a very, very, very difficult, traumatic childhood that I still deal with the ramifications from every single day. I'm 42 years old, still deal with it every day. And I wanted to put my story out there and share that even, through something pretty horrific, something that even made me suicidal at times throughout my teenage years, certainly, that by focusing on the needs of others and by focusing on doing things for other people, it was a way to decenter myself and continue living, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that was the lesson that I'm hoping that people get from it. I'm hoping that people read it and feel a sense of connectivity, a sense of community, a sense of they're not alone if they had a similar story, because this is something that most people don't write about. Most people don't have the chance to write about because, not many people can break away from their families and tell their own truths. And I just wanted people to know that they're not alone, essentially.
Yes. And also that, once the pandemic is over and we're back to normal, the problems that are essentially hangovers from the pandemic and from isolation, all they just have it intensified. And that's why, as you say, you see these spikes in numbers.
Right. It's any kind of domestic problems, any kind of spousal problems, partner abuse, even child abuse. Once everybody was in lockdown and kept in their houses, and children having to do online school through computer screens every day, all of those problems would have been amplified and were amplified during that time. And again, we're still all just kind of reeling, and we haven't had a chance to really mourn as a nation. We haven't had a chance to really deal with any of this stuff on any kind of psychological level. That's what's the most unbelievable to me about all of this, is that we haven't actually processed this as a nation, I don't think.
And I worry we're not going to force ourselves to find the time. Speaking of personal stories, Dr. Williams, your chapter 19, Dreams of My Great-Grandfather, is, of course, very personal and very immediate. Why did you decide to write that chapter?
I think like a lot of people during the pandemic, it was an opportunity to revisit my family history. Mm-hmm. And I actually happened to be on a television program, a Canadian television program, watching the funeral of George Floyd, and here in Minneapolis, the memorial service. And Al Sharpton was, reaching the crescendo of this. And he talked about George Floyd's story being the story of Black folk in America. And that struck me because, in reflecting on my own family history and what I'd uncovered about the murder of my great-grandfather, and then the subsequent killing of my great-uncle, and then the killing by the person that killed my great-uncle by police in a high-speed chase in which the officers are acquitted, even though they caused his death. It was this stark reminder that You only have to dig, not even that deeply to uncover this type of history that exposes, those fault lines, those through lines, and the epigenetic harm that neuroscientists and psychiatrists talk about. The question is, do these things that are unresolved leave scars? And if they do, how do they show up and how do they impact us both physically, emotionally, psychologically, but also in our distrust of institutions, which we've talked about a lot today. It was interesting for me because I sent that piece to Kerie Leigh, and I had just had heart surgery myself, so I was feeling my own sense of mortality. My father had been diagnosed with cancer, and I lost him this past September. And I was reading Kerie Leigh's piece a few weeks later and had this kind of outburst of emotion, I think primarily because she begins her piece in particular by talking about these haunting dreams that she was having related to her own family experience. But it raised this question that came up in 2020 by the American Psychological Association about how COVID was haunting our dreams. And the idea is that's in the immediate aftermath and that'll go away. Once this trauma is done, people will forget, but you don't forget. And we don't know the ways in which those things show up and manifest themselves in the types of deaths of despair that Kerie Leigh talks about in her essay, which link directly to my own, because where I wind up is asking the question pointedly at the end. You hear George Floyd's daughter declare, "My father changed the world." And I have to stand there in my discomfort and say, did he? As here in Minneapolis, we had Amir Locke, and now we have Tyree Nichols, and we're waiting for the, unfortunately, this kind of endless cycle, no George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We tell stories. There was this kind of celebration last year of finally getting an Emmett Till movie, even though there had been a phenomenal PBS documentary on the death of Emmett Till. And this idea that somehow essential justice is justice. But I disagree. I think we disagree. What we're saying is that we need the courage to tackle these issues directly in a way that the deaths of despair that Kerie Leigh talk about don't manifest themselves in the epigenetic harm that's at the core of my essay. The scars, the trauma that I bear internally as a result of that, and that I think, millions have experienced and continue to experience when we think about not just the historical injustice, but what we've endured the last 3 years.
Well, if you don't mind, may we go back to this conclusion? We talked a little bit about it before the break. The conclusion, Buzzkillers, is entitled Stress Test and Saving the Soul of America. And of course, the themes for in the conclusion follow through like threads throughout the book. But may I ask you a little bit about the question of saving the soul of America? How do you think, well, for instance, first of all, how do you think that the chapters in this book can help us understand the broader implications of the various moments we've lived through? But how do you think this stress test might give us indicators of how to help save the soul? Professor Merritt.
Well, I think that, again, anytime that we have these kind of cataclysmic events, these periods of mass death in American history, whether it's the Civil War, whether it was the Spanish flu, whether it was the AIDS epidemic, there is always a time for great change that immediately follows that. And so I hold on to hope of that. And honestly, recently at book talks that I've been giving around especially the East Coast, I'll have young people come in and question, how are you holding on to hope right now? We had the protest movement going full force in 2020, and now it just feels like it has petered out, and they're really just grasping at anything they can to have hope. And I say two things to them. I say, first of all, there's hope in the labor movement, and that is always where hope starts in this country. That is the most progressive place in our nation's history of people coming together from different races, different ethnicities, and working together in a class-based movement. But also that, we have to understand that any kind of movement building takes years, sometimes decades. We're talking about the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. When we talk about Reconstruction, that's the 1860s and into the 1870s. These are long movements. They take a lot of time. And there are years where literally what activists should be doing is resting and taking stock of the movement and taking care of themselves, taking care of their own mental and physical health. And I think that's so important for people, especially again, after the fact that almost everyone has had COVID at this point. And we're even trying to get our bodies healthy again from that, going through those, even continually going through that kind of cycle of, viral load and anything that's left over in a sense of long COVID. So there are periods of any civil rights movement where there's not going to be as much activity. And those are the times where people need to really focus on self-care, self-love, and building up their communities and their families and their neighborhoods.
Dr. Williams, clearly it's not an exaggeration to say that the soul needs to be saved. Please pick up on some of the things Dr. Merritt said and how do you see the book, but more importantly, the broader conversation that we hope the book prompts as helping bring that about?
I don't think it's an exaggeration at all. And in fact, we were very intentional about the use of stress tests.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say to your audience, I doubt that many people have had a stress test as part of a routine physical at any point in their life. Typically, when you are getting on a treadmill for a stress test, it's because some ailment has been identified and you're trying to diagnose preemptively what you believe could be triggering what could be a life-threatening event, a fatal event. And so a stress test is not a bad thing. It means that you have an opportunity in that moment to create some type of intervention that can save the patient, that can save the person. And we thought COVID, the racial reckoning, January 6th, our stress test for our democratic institutions, our democratic republic. It is democracy in the crosshairs. It is tackling the issue of racial injustice, tackling the issue of gender inequality, tackling the issue of labor rights, all the things that came, again, I go back to Jacqueline Dowd Hall's use of the grief that came before the grief, the fight for 15 in this country and minimum wage, taking down Confederate monuments, the Me Too movement, the Muslim ban and the election of Trump. This was all precursor to 2020 and this kind of opportunity or moment to kind of refocus and say, what's the end goal here? I will say that I think that the essays come together in a way unexpectedly through the writing of Robin D.G. Kelley in his piece where he's writing about writing this obituary for his father who died in February of 2020. And he begins this remarkable piece. He said, I had one job to write the obituary. If I think about this book and I think about the conclusion, I say, in the same way that Kerie Leigh did, we have one job to write the obituary for injustice in our moment by unflinchingly looking at those elements of our society, socially, politically, economically, culturally, which continue to put us on this treadmill where we need a stress test for American democracy, to embrace what Congressman John Lewis wrote so eloquently about in the New York Times, where he said, look, we have to study the past because we have to understand, in a way that Kerie Leigh described it, that freedom is a constant struggle, but it's a long struggle. We have to develop a global consciousness around us. Wasn't just what happened, the violence that's visited on George Floyd's body. The reason that resonated in Australia and in England and in France and other colonial places is because white supremacy has been global. So there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of opportunity for us to think about how we can be part of the intervention and how we can write the future in a way that maybe in the way that Kerie Leigh said, because, young people ask the same questions, we've done so much, we feel that we haven't accomplished anything. And you always remind them, when the second spring comes, you have the opportunity to look back and reflect and say, in the way that John Lewis did, 2020 wasn't 1965 or even 1956. That's a good thing. It doesn't mean that work isn't still there to be done. And the exciting thing is that we get to be part of writing that chapter and taking the language that John Lewis is actually taking from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's motto, together we can redeem the soul of America, to redeem the soul of America. That's real. The founders, as imperfect as they were, created a blueprint, a template for a society which can actually approach what King meant when he talked about the beloved community, but only if we write the obituary for those pieces that continue to divide us and to perpetuate injustice, and we get rid of those institutions that have continued to hold up and buttress white supremacy, gender inequality, so on and so forth. I believe we can do that. The essays in this volume give me hope. Kerie Leigh talked about the labor movement. That gives me hope. Young activists give me hope. They inspire me in the same way that they inspired John Lewis.
Well, I can't imagine a better way to end a discussion on this book because, of course, we do want the obituaries of so many of these things to be written and spoken and for things to be over. But we also recognize, of course, that it's a never-ending fight. Buzzkillers, the book is on the Buzzkill bookshelf. It's there. Please get it right away. This book, this type of book especially, is exactly why I started doing this show however many years ago. So I'm very, very grateful to Dr. Merritt and Dr. Williams for coming on the show. Let me say thank you to you directly.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And please, please, please come back on the show when you have a chance. I know you're constantly working, and our listeners would love to hear more of your research. For everyone out there, please go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com. Do everything you need to do there. Sign up for the show. Sign up for the free newsletter. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and on your other platforms. And we will talk to all of you next week.